first thing I noticed wasn't the masks or the robes, but the fact that I couldn't hear their breathing, even though they were standing only inches away from the plate glass window. It was 11:45 on Christmas Eve, and the gas station was a lonely island of fluorescent light in a sea of freezing, pitch-black highway. I was stuck behind the counter, counting down the minutes until my shift ended, when the four of them drifted out of the shadows like ghosts in red velvet. They were dressed as traditional Victorian carolers, complete with heavy capes and top hats, but their faces were covered by painted porcelain masks that didn't have mouth holes. They stood in a perfect semicircle just outside the door, and then, without a single signal, they began to sing Silent Night in a harmony so perfect it felt unnatural. I tried to go back to my paperwork, telling myself it was just a group of local theater kids looking for tips, but something about the way they didn't move their bodies as they sang made the hair on my arms stand up. Their voices were beautiful, but the sound didn't seem to be coming from their throats. It felt like it was vibrating through the glass itself. Why were they here, miles away from the nearest town, on a night when the temperature was dropping below zero? I looked at the security monitor and realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that their car wasn't in the lot. They had walked out of the woods, and as the second verse of the song began, I noticed that the tallest one in the middle was holding a heavy iron crowbar hidden partially behind his back. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach, and I felt the sudden, desperate urge to lock the front door, even though it was already bolted. I stayed behind the bulletproof glass of my booth, watching them, wondering if they knew I could see the weapon. They didn't stop singing, and the volume seemed to be increasing. A wall of sound that filled the small convenience store and drowned out the hum of the refrigerators. I reached for the landline to call the police, but the dial tone was gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulsing that matched the beat of the carolers' song. Had they cut the lines before they stepped into the light, or was the storm finally taking its toll on the aging infrastructure? I watched the tall one step forward, his porcelain face reflecting the harsh overhead lights, and he began to tap the crowbar rhythmically against the glass door. Each strike was perfectly timed with the beat of the music, a metallic clack that punctuated the lyrics about peace and heavenly sleep. I felt trapped in a cage of light, a target for whatever twisted game they were playing. I looked toward the back office, thinking about the heavy steel exit door, but I knew I couldn't make a run for it across the open parking lot without them seeing me. Why were they still singing? If they wanted to rob the place, why hadn't they just smashed the glass and come inside? The answer came to me when I heard a faint, high-pitched screeching sound coming from the storage room at the back of the building. It was the sound of metal being slowly, methodically ground away, and I realized with horror that the singing was a distraction. The four people out front were there to keep my eyes fixed on the window, to keep me paralyzed by the strangeness of their performance, while someone else was at the back door with a portable grinder. The harmony of the carolers was so loud now that it was vibrating the candy bars on the shelves, masking the sound of the power tool cutting through the hinges of the rear entrance. I was being hunted from two sides, and the realization that I had been staring at the performers for 10 minutes while my only exit was being destroyed made me feel sick. I ducked behind the counter, staying low so they couldn't see my movement, and scrambled toward the small closet where we kept the emergency supplies. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them, and every time the carolers reached a crescendo, I heard the metallic thud of the back door being weakened. I found a heavy flare gun in the emergency kit and felt the cold weight of it in my hand, knowing I only had one shot to make a difference. The singing suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was 1,000 times more terrifying than the music had been. I stayed frozen, holding my breath, listening to the sound of the back door finally creaking open on its ruined hinges. I heard the heavy boots of a man entering the storage room, the footsteps slow and deliberate, showing no fear of being caught. From the front of the store, I heard the sound of the glass door shattering as the tall caroler finally used the crowbar to bypass the lock. They were inside now, moving through the aisles, their robes rustling against the metal shelves like dry leaves. I knew if I stayed in the closet, they would find me eventually, and there was nowhere else to run in this tiny building. I crawled out of the closet and into the narrow space behind the cigarette racks, watching as two of the masked figures rounded the corner. their porcelain faces tilted upward as if they were sniffing the air. "We know you're still here, Sam," one of them whispered, and the sound of my own name coming from behind those frozen masks made my blood run cold. How did they know who I was? I hadn't even put on my name tag that evening. I realized then that this wasn't a random robbery. They had been watching me, perhaps for weeks, planning this specific moment when the world was tucked away in its beds. I saw the tall one reach into his robe and pull out a roll of heavy silver duct tape and a hunting knife, and I knew that if I didn't move now, I would never see the sun rise. I waited until the two in the front were deep in the middle of the store, their backs turned to the main counter, and then I stood up with the flare gun raised. I didn't aim for them. I aimed for the stack of windshield washer fluid and motor oil displays right next to the front door. The flare erupted in a blinding flash of magnesium light, hitting the plastic containers and starting a sudden, roaring chemical fire that sent a wall of thick black smoke between me and the intruders. The masked figures hissed and backed away from the heat, their porcelain faces glowing orange in the sudden inferno. I didn't wait to see what they did next. I bolted toward the back door, leaping over the wreckage of the storage room and burst out into the freezing night air. I didn't run for the road where they might have someone waiting. I ran straight into the dense tree-line, the snow crunching under my boots as I pushed through the thorns and brush. I looked back once and saw the gas station engulfed in flames, a bright orange beacon in the middle of the dark forest, and I saw the silhouettes of the carolers standing in the parking lot, watching the fire instead of chasing me. I kept running until I reached the highway a mile down the road, flagging down a passing snowplow driver who called the police on his radio. When the authorities arrived at the scene, the station was a blackened shell. I have spent the last 3 hours staring at the dark SUV parked at the very edge of my driveway, and the most terrifying part isn't the fact that the engine has been idling since 9 o'clock, but the fact that the driver hasn't moved a single muscle the entire time. It is Christmas Eve, and the suburban silence of my neighborhood is usually a comfort. But tonight, the heavy blanket of snow falling across the lawn feels more like a burial shroud. I first noticed the vehicle when I went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water, and I saw the faint, rhythmic pulse of its hazard lights reflecting off the white drifts like a slow, bleeding heartbeat. There was no reason for a delivery driver to be out this late in a blizzard, and there was certainly no reason for them to sit there for hours without ever approaching the front door. The hook came when I finally decided to turn on the porch light to signal that I was home and watching, and instead of driving away, the driver's side door slowly creaked open. A man stepped out, dressed in a generic navy blue courier uniform, and he reached into the back seat to pull out a massive, rectangular box wrapped in shimmering gold paper and tied with a blood-red velvet ribbon. He didn't walk toward the porch. Instead, he walked to the very center of my front lawn, knelt down in the knee-deep snow, and placed the box facing my window. He looked up, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes, and he pointed a single, gloved finger directly at me before turning around and getting back into his car. He didn't leave. He just sat there again, the engine humming, waiting for me to go outside and claim the gift he had left in the freezing cold. I retreated from the window, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I checked the locks on the front door for the 5th time in 10 minutes. Who would be delivering a package at midnight on Christmas Eve? And why did he feel the need to point at me like he was marking a target? I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That a man delivered a present and then sat in his car? It wasn't a crime yet, but every instinct in my body was screaming that I was in imminent, calculated danger. I watched from the shadows of the living room as the minutes ticked by, the red ribbon on the box fluttering in the wind like a warning flag. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when it's fueled by fear, and eventually, the silence of the house became more oppressive than the threat outside. I needed to know what was in that box, or I needed to know why that man was still watching my house with such predatory patience. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and the fire poker from the hearth, my hands shaking so violently that the metal clattered against the stone. I cracked the front door open just an inch, the bitter winter air rushing in and stealing the warmth from the hallway, and I shouted into the darkness, asking the man what he wanted. There was no response, only the low, mechanical drone of the SUV's exhaust and the sound of the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees. I took one step onto the porch, then another, the frozen wood groaning under my weight as I descended the stairs into the deep snow. The man in the car didn't flinch. He just sat behind the tinted windshield, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the light from the street lamps. I reached the box, the gold paper crinkling under my touch, and I realized with a jolt of horror that there was no shipping label and no to or from written anywhere on the surface. There was only a small, handwritten note tucked under the red ribbon that read, "You forgot to lock the basement window this morning." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the blood drained from my face, and I realized that the man in the car wasn't the primary threat. He was the sentry. He was the one meant to keep my attention focused on the front lawn while someone else was already inside the perimeter of my home. I turned back toward the house, my eyes darting to the dark corners of the porch, and that's when I saw the basement bulkhead door standing wide open against the white snow. I hadn't gone into the basement all day, which meant someone had been down there, in the dark, waiting for me to be distracted by the mysterious gift on the lawn. I didn't think. I just ran, but I didn't run back into the house where a trap was already set for me. I bolted toward the side of the yard, pushing through the heavy snow toward my neighbor's fence, hoping to reach the safety of their back porch. As soon as I moved, the SUV's headlights slammed on, blinding me with a wall of white light that turned the falling snow into a blur of chaotic sparks. The driver roared the engine and began to lurch the vehicle forward, not onto the street, but directly over the curb and onto my lawn, chasing me through the yard like a hunter chasing a panicked animal. I could hear the tires spinning and tearing through the frozen turf behind me, and I realized that the delivery driver was trying to pin me against the fence. I dove over the low stone wall just as the front bumper of the SUV slammed into the masonry with a sickening crunch of metal and stone. I didn't stop to look back. I scrambled up the neighbor's stairs and began pounding on their glass sliding door, screaming for them to wake up and call the police. I looked back toward my own house and saw a second figure, dressed in dark clothing, stepping out of my front door. He was holding my laptop and my safe, but when he saw the SUV crashed into the wall and me standing on the neighbor's lighted porch, he dropped the items and fled into the darkness of the woods. The SUV reversed frantically, its bumper hanging off and dragging on the pavement, and sped away into the night just as my neighbor flicked on the lights and appeared at the door with a phone in his hand. I collapsed onto the mat, my lungs burning from the cold air and the sheer terror of the last few minutes. When the police arrived and finally opened the gold-wrapped box on the lawn, they didn't find a bomb or a weapon. They found a high-end thermal camera and a set of printed photos of me sleeping in my bed, taken from the corner of my own bedroom over the course of the last 3 nights. The red ribbon wasn't for a gift. It was a marker, a sign that the delivery was complete and the house was ready to be emptied. I don't stay in that house anymore, and I never leave the curtains open after the sun goes down. The smell of pine used to be my favorite part of the holidays, but now, it just smells like cold sweat and the metallic tang of a sharpened saw. It was nearly midnight on Christmas Eve, and I was the only person left at Miller's Greenery, a sprawling muddy lot on the edge of town where the streetlights don't quite reach. My boss had promised me a double bonus if I stayed until the very last minute to catch the late-night procrastinators. But the wind was picking up, and the rows of unsold balsam firs were whistling in a way that made me feel like I was being watched by 1,000 needle-covered eyes. I was just about to kill the generator and lock the chain-link gate when a pair of rusted headlights flickered at the entrance, and a battered black pickup truck idled slowly into the lot without making a sound on the fresh powder. A man stepped out, his boots sinking deep into the slush, but he didn't look like a father rushing home to save Christmas for his kids. He was wearing a heavy, grease-stained canvas coat and a hunter's orange cap pulled so low I could only see the jagged line of his jaw and a thick, gray beard. He didn't greet me. He just walked straight to the back of his truck and lowered the tailgate, revealing a long, heavy roll of thick plastic tarp and a coil of industrial rope. He looked at me then, his eyes reflecting the dying glow of my flashlight, and he asked in a voice that sounded like grinding stones if I had anything sturdy enough to hold 6 feet of weight without snapping the branches. I tried to laugh it off, telling him that most of our trees were top tier, but he didn't smile back. He just started walking toward the very back of the lot where the tallest, thickest trees were kept in the shadows. I followed him, my pulse beginning to throb in my temples, because I couldn't just let a customer wander around near the equipment sheds after hours. The further we walked, the more I realized that he wasn't looking at the shape of the needles or the fullness of the branches. He was measuring the trunks with his hands, checking the thickness of the wood as if he were building a scaffold. Why would someone need a tree that reinforced at 1 in the morning on the most silent night of the year? "This one will do," he muttered, stopping in front of a massive, 8-foot noble fir that was tucked away in a corner where the fence had been bent inward by the wind. He reached into his coat and pulled out his own folding saw instead of asking to use mine, and the blade glinted with a wicked, serrated edge under the moonlight. I stood back, feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in my chest, as he began to work on the base of the tree with a frantic, aggressive energy that seemed far too intense for a holiday chore. Every time the saw bit into the wood, he would glance over his shoulder at me, checking my position, making sure I wasn't getting too close to the truck he had left idling by the gate. I decided then that the bonus wasn't worth it, and I told him I was going back to the shed to grab some twine for his roof, but as I turned to walk away, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The tailgate of his truck was still down, and the heavy plastic tarp had shifted in the wind, revealing the distinct shape of a human boot protruding from the folds. It wasn't a new boot. It was scuffed and caked in the same red mud that lined the back of our lot, and it didn't move as the truck vibrated with the engine's hum. My heart felt like it was going to burst through my ribs, and I realized with a sickening clarity that he wasn't here to buy a tree for his living room. He was here because he needed something to wrap a body inside so he could transport it through the police checkpoints as holiday cargo. I didn't run immediately, knowing that if he saw me panic, he would use that saw on me before I could reach the gate. I forced my legs to move at a normal pace toward the small wooden shack where we kept the phone and the keys, but I could hear the sawing behind me stop abruptly. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the man's heavy breathing as he realized I had looked toward his truck. "You forgot your twine, kid," he shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp edge of malice that hadn't been there before. I heard the thud of the tree hitting the snow, followed by the rapid, heavy crunching of his boots as he began to sprint toward me across the frozen mud. I scrambled into the shack and slammed the flimsy wooden door, fumbling for the heavy iron bolt just as his shoulder slammed into the exterior wall with the force of a car crash. The whole structure groaned, and I could hear him growling on the other side, his saw scraping against the wood of the door as he looked for a gap in the slats. I reached for the landline, but the cord had been ripped clean out of the wall. He must have done it the moment he arrived while I was distracted by the truck's headlights. I was trapped in a box of thin plywood, and I could hear him moving toward the back window, the serrated blade of his saw already biting into the frame. I looked around the dark shed, my eyes landing on a gallon jug of industrial-grade chainsaw oil and a box of long-reach matches we used for the warming fire. As the man shattered the glass of the window and reached a gloved hand inside to unlatch the frame, I unscrewed the cap and poured the thick, slick oil all over the floorboards and the windowsill. I struck a match, the flare of light illuminating his furious, bearded face just inches from mine, and I dropped it into the puddle of oil. The shack didn't explode, but it ignited into a wall of greasy, black fire that forced him to scream and recoil, his sleeves catching the flames as the heat pushed him back into the snow. I didn't wait for the fire to spread to the roof. I kicked open the side door and ran toward the back fence, ignoring the gate entirely. I climbed the chain link mesh, the metal cutting into my palms, and tumbled over the top just as the man scrambled back to his truck, desperate to get away before the fire department arrived. I hid in the deep shadows of the drainage ditch across the street, watching as he sped out of the lot, the heavy tree dragging behind his truck because he hadn't had time to tie it down. The body, still wrapped in the tarp, rolled out of the bed and onto the asphalt as he took a sharp turn, but he didn't stop. He vanished into the dark, leaving his grim secret behind under the flickering streetlights. When the police finally unrolled that tarp, they found a local man who had been missing for 2 days, and the sturdy tree the killer had chosen was sitting right next to him, a silent witness to a Christmas Eve nightmare. I still work outside, but never at night and never during the holidays, because I know that sometimes the things people are carrying in their cars are far heavier than a simple evergreen tree.